I think the scripture that best describes the first advent of Christ's coming to earth is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9. Or maybe we could say that best describes what was accomplished through Christ's first coming to earth. And I actually made reference to this verse several weeks ago. But looking at 2 Corinthians 8:9, it says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich." And as I said, I made reference to this as we had our dear friends, the Krupps, with us, missionaries to Africa. And as they were sharing some of what they experienced in Africa, we realize afresh that one has to divest himself, actually become poor, to go to a place of deprivation such as Africa. And you have to leave the comforts, the creature comforts behind, and go to a place that is not so pleasant. So you have to kind of become poor to make others rich. Amen? You leave friends, you leave the creature comforts, the land that where abundance rejoiceth, and you go to the land that's deprived, to hearts made hard by hatred. And you do all that for what purpose? To make them eternally rich. Is that not so? That's the purpose in going. I think John Peterson's hymn, "So Send I You," best describes the missionary, the plight of the missionary, but it also gives us a picture of Christ, who leaves all, who becomes poor, so that he can enrich us. And forgive me for quoting a few songs here this morning. I was thinking of a number of songs. I could almost make a cantata out of this message, but just quoting from John Peterson's hymn, "So Send I You," gives us a nice picture of the Lord's coming to earth, the first advent. But now the Lord is commissioning his disciples. "So send I you to labor unrewarded, to serve unpaid, unloved, unsought, unknown, to bear rebuke, to suffer scorn and scoffing. So send I you to toil for me alone. So send I you to bind the bruised and broken, or wandering souls to work, to weep, to wake, to bear the burdens of a world aweary. So send I you to suffer for my sake. So send I you to loneliness and longing, with heart a-hungering for the loved and known, forsaking kin and kindred, friend and dear ones. So send I you to know my love alone." See, there has to be a depriving of self to go to make others rich. So send I you to leave your life's ambition, to die to dear desire, self-will resign, to labor long in love where men revile you. So send I you to lose your life in mine. So send I you to hearts made hard by hatred, to eyes made blind because they will not see, to spend, though it be blood, to spend and spare not. So send I you to taste of Calvary. Beautiful song of John Peterson. I think we were privileged in one sense. We used to live in an area where we used to listen to John Peterson live, because this is years ago. He wrote hundreds of hymns and songs, but he was on a local radio station there in Pennsylvania. And I used to like his program in the evening, Silver Strings. Of course, not many people shared my opinion on that program, but I did. I liked it. But this song describes the plight of the missionary, He deprives himself from all that is dear and known. He becomes poor in order to enrich others, to invest the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to enable them to regain what was lost. And much was lost. So we think of the missionary and the plight of the missionary and what is involved. We have a missionary here today who's spent some time in India. We visited her there back in 97. She was in India. Deprived of some of the creature comforts that you enjoy here. But how much greater was it for Christ, who has to vacate his throne, the ivory palaces of heaven, the streets of gold, the glories of heaven, and he becomes poor. He divests himself of everything. He allows himself to be made an embryo in the womb of a woman to make his entrance into this world. He puts on flesh and blood so that he can feel the pain and the temptation of mankind, so that he can be the faithful high priest. Amen? So he has compassion on a creation that fell. In Psalm 45, little picture here of Christ. In fact, these verses are quoted in the New Testament referring to Christ, so it's definitely Christ here referring to his throne, which was eternal. It was forever, and it shall be forever. Psalm 45, verse 6, Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of thy kingdom is a right scepter. Thou lovest righteousness and hatest wickedness. Therefore God, thy God, hath anointed thee with the oil of gladness above thy fellows. All thy garments smell of myrrh and aloes and cassia out of the ivory palaces whereby they have made thee glad. I don't know if you can get a picture of this. Ivory palaces in heaven, streets of gold, the glories of heaven. He vacates all of that. He divests himself of the wisdom that he had in heaven so that he can come to earth and grow into the realization of who he was. He was the Son of God. Not being born into privilege as a king should be, but born in poor circumstances, poor parents, born in a stable, working and suffering all the infirmity of mankind. Let's look at a few more verses. Book of Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. It says, But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man. Made a little lower than the angels. He had to be made a little lower than the angels so that he could die. God can't die. So he has to be made a little lower than the angels. He is going to, as Paul calls him, the second Adam. First Adam comes up from the dust. The second Adam comes down from heaven. But he is going to have to pass the test that Adam failed in order to cause us to regain what was lost. So he becomes man, and he takes the punishment of fallen mankind and takes our death sentence. So we're talking about second death. Amen? We're still not alleviated from dying the first time, unless we happen to be here when the Lord returns and we can qualify for the rapture. But he saved us from the second death. That is, those who have experienced a second birth. You have to experience the second birth if you want to be saved from the second death. Amen? And still in chapter 2 of Hebrews, going on to verse 10, it says, "For it became him for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering." Bringing many sons to glory. Christ deprived himself, and he becomes poor, for the purpose of redeeming many sons and bringing them back to glory. So he becomes poor so that we can regain what was lost. And then in the subsequent verses here, going on, verse 14, "For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage." There was tremendous fear of death in the Old Testament. Verse 16, "For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. Wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself hath suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted." So he experienced all the temptation of mankind, and probably to the extreme degree, yet without yielding to it. He was Son of God, he was Son of Man. And he suffered all things that he might be a faithful high priest. When we come to our high priest in heaven, the one who resurrected from death, and we come to him in our weakness and our infirmity, he can identify with us. He knows what we're going through, and he can give grace to us to make it through, that he might be a merciful high priest. And he releases grace to overcome that temptation as he did. Amen. I hope we can appreciate what was done for us in that first advent. So he made it possible for us to regain the crown that was lost. And let's just consider for a moment some of what was lost, because you look at man in his first state, he's made in the image of God. He's given dominion over all the works of his hands, over that first domain. He's crowned with glory and honor, as the scripture tells us. He has dignity. He is clothed with light. He's given eternal life. I mean, if he hadn't failed that test, Adam would still be here in the flesh if he had not failed. He had immortality. He's placed in a paradise. He has a beautiful home. And where there was peace and joy and singing, and there was no sweat, and there was no aches and pains, and there was no turning gray. I mean, he had it made there. He had communion with Christ. He had it made. But then, of course, that he failed the one little test. Still in Hebrews 2, backing up now to verse 6, it says, "But when in a certain place testified, saying, What is man, that thou art mindful of him, or the sons of man, that thou visitest him? Thou madest him a little lower than the angels," this is man. "Thou crownedst him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him." So God gave man dominion over everything, even over angels. But now we see not yet all things put under him. That last sentence tells us about the fall, doesn't it? He put all things in under him, but wait a minute. It was because of the fall that we see that not all things are under him now. And that's why Christ came. So man was robbed. He's like the man on the Jericho road. He loses everything. He becomes an alien. He loses his home. He loses his crown. His life becomes sweat and toil. Fear of fellow beings. There's anxiety in his life. There's a fear of deprivation. I think man has this inner fear that he's going to be missing something or something's going to be taken from him. He spends his life trying to save and hoard and prepare for the ultimate, but the ultimate is death anyway. But he's afraid to die. He has no peace or joy or real satisfaction. Some of life, naturally speaking, can provide fun for a moment, pleasure for a moment. It can, but it's only for a moment too. But you see, Christ came to reclaim us, to enable us to regain the crown that was lost. Let's look at a few more verses in Romans. Romans chapter 5. You see the two Adams here. We're not going to go into it in any depth, but it says in Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse 8. But God commended his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. God saved us when we were enemies. Verse 12, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. It's because of that one man, because of our first father, we have to suffer the consequence. And yet, because of another man who comes down from heaven, who becomes poor, dropping down to verse 19, whereas by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Because Christ was willing to deprive himself, to become poor, to put on flesh and blood, to suffer the temptation of mankind, and through this act of submission and sacrifice, he pays the penalty for all of us so that we can regain what was lost. In fact, even come back into a better place, into a better position than what Adam lost, into a greater paradise. Eternal life and peace and joy. The psalmist, that's my last portion here, Psalm 113, he puts it like this, Psalm 113, beginning in verse 4. Let's look at verse 5. It says, who is like unto the Lord our God, who dwelleth on high, who humbleth himself to behold the things that are in heaven. Let's see, Lord, who is far above the heavens, humbles himself to behold the things that are in heaven. And in earth he raiseth up the poor out of the dust, and lifteth the needy out of the dunghill, that he may set him with princes, even with the princes of his people. Takes us from the garbage pile, or refuge pile, and causes us to sit with princes in eternity. I probably related this story before, but Years ago, back in my meat cutting days, I used to cut meat down on Pittsburgh Avenue, and I went home for lunch. I lived on Pittsburgh Avenue. But there was always that train that was coming by, and so, I was always trying to make the train. But anyway, as over the months and years that I was down there, I used to see this wino walking the track. And the Lord began to convict me about this man. But I was always coming back from lunch, and I always had just a couple minutes to make it. This is back in the days when you got docked. I mean, after you've been late 3 times, you could get fired. I mean, today, I don't know how things work, but back in those days, that's how it was. So I was rushing back from my lunch, and I would see this guy, and the Lord kept telling me to witness to this man. And I was always late, so I was always rushing. I haven't got time today, haven't got time. And then all of a sudden, the man disappears. I don't see him anymore. So I'm feeling real bad. I'm saying, Lord, please, if I see this man again, I don't care if I'm late. I don't even care if I get fired. Now, if I see this guy again, I will stop and I will witness to this man. So, lo and behold, I'm coming back with just a few minutes to spare, and there he is walking the railroad tracks. I got out, walked up there. He was afraid. He thought I was after something. I don't know what he was thinking. And I started to tell him about Christ and how that he came to take us from I was using these verses here, take us from the refuge pile, and he enables us to become princes, to redeem us. And the man was saying, it's funny, I had a dream the other night that angels were taking me to heaven. Anyway, I presented Christ to him, and I went back and got my car, and I went back to work. And I don't think I ever saw the man again. But, that's why Christ came to earth. To take us from the dung pile, the garbage pile, enable us to inherit a throne and glory. He became poor so that we could become rich. He enabled us to regain everything that was lost. So that act of servitude and impoverishment enables us to become rich.
How rich I am since Jesus came my way, redeemed my soul and turned my night to day. How very rich I am. Such peace and joy I never knew before, and countless blessings from his boundless store. How very rich I am. There's a greater glory in a sunset, a brighter twinkle in a star. There's much more promise in a rainbow, more music in a singing bird. By far, all things have changed. My eyes once blind can see. The whole wide world is now a symphony.